I
Sweet.
know a lot of you were very excited about the hot conference DevTernity, which turned out to be just a huge AI scam. And then Carson was not able to give this amazing talk about HTMX, about getting rid of JavaScript fatigue. But guess what? We got the man, the myth, the legend, Carson Gross on here to give the presentation about HTMX. And then afterwards, we will do a little bit of a Q&A, and we will find out just how boomer us combined actually are. So Carson, I'm going to give you the stage. I'm going to hide me. I'm going to hide this, and it looks like you're, oh, dang it. Discord effed up. Dang, did you disconnect and reconnect?
I didn't touch anything.
You did. You did. I know you did. Okay, there we go. You're looking so good right now. You're looking so good.
Okay. Okay.
So you can take it away now.
I want to see the chat too. Well, okay, cool.
Do you want me to put chat on the screen during the recording?
Yeah, that'd be good, I think.
Okay, there you go. We got a little chat up there. Chat, say hi to Carson.
Okay, let's do one thing real quick. All right, so I'm going to give a talk real quick, hopefully on what's up, guys? I'm going to give a talk on JavaScript. No, I'm going to give a talk on HTMX, and this was a talk. It's kind of a talk I was planning on giving at a conference that it seems like it blew up. I didn't follow exactly what happened, but it seemed like it was pretty funny. And it didn't happen. And so now the Prime Gym was nice enough to let me give the talk here. I'm going to do a compressed version of it. I think you guys, have you ever heard, has anyone here ever heard of HTMX? This might be a new thing for people on this stream, but basically, you know, I'm going to talk about HTMX and its relationship with JavaScript. So let's see here. About me. So my name's Carson Gross. I run Big Sky Software, which is just me. It's not a real thing, and my dogs. And I make some software. So HTMX, a thing called HyperScript. I wrote a kind of a funny essay called grugbrain.dev, which is sort of my take on how to develop and not paint yourself into a corner by trying to be too clever. And then I've got a book that's on kind of HTMX and the more general ideas of hypermedia called Hypermedia Systems. And that's, you can read it for free online or you can buy it if you want. So what I wanted to talk about today, is I wanted to kind of review with you all what hypermedia is and talk about how HTMX generalizes that idea. And then I wanted to look at the relationship between JavaScript and HTMX, go through a couple of HTMX demos, and then maybe reconsider that relationship. So let's talk first about HTMX, or talk first about hypermedia really, but just as an introduction, HTMX is a hypermedia-oriented front-end library. And all that means is that it uses what I call hypermedia exchanges to update the UI. So rather than using JSON, we use HTML. So rather than getting JSON back from a server in a web app and then turning it into a UI update in some way, either reactively or using sort of client-side templates or whatever, you just get HTML back and then insert that HTML into the page. And that seems pretty simple, and it is pretty simple, but there's some deeper ideas behind it. So it's really trying to focus on enhancing HTML rather than replacing HTML, which is what a lot of stuff does in the JavaScript world. So HTMX is written in JavaScript, you know, and people will say, oh, with HTMX, you don't have to write any JavaScript, and someone freaks out and says HTMX is JavaScript. And that's true, but if you're using HTMX, you as the user of HTMX typically don't have to write a ton of JavaScript at times, although, as we'll see later, there are times when you do use quite a bit of it. You know, the way it works, I'm sure everyone on this stream has seen it before, but basically you put attributes in your HTML, and those HTMLs, or those attributes, drive behavior in the HTML. So what I wanted to do is, before we get into how HTML generalizes, how HTMX, generalizes HTML, is I wanted to talk a little bit about what hypermedia is. Someone asked, is it HTMX all caps or HTMX lower caps? HTMX is case insensitive. Okay, so what is hypermedia? What is hypermedia? HTMX is a hypermedia oriented library. What does that mean? Well, there's a bunch of people argue. One of the things that's tough about hypermedia is that there's a lot of very disagreeable people who are in that world. And they have a lot of different definitions and yell at each other a whole bunch. But the way I like to think of hypermedia is it's a media, it's not like a text, that has hypermedia controls in it. And so, okay, fine. What's a hypermedia control? And to understand what a hypermedia control is, I think the easiest thing to do is to just look at a stupid, simple web page. So we've got a stupid, simple web page here with a body, and all it's got is a link to an about page with some text in it. And this anchor tag, the href stands for hypermedia reference. This anchor tag right here is a hypermedia control. What it allows you to do is, if you think about it, so going back to what hypermedia was sort of at the start, it was this idea of media, like a book. People were comparing HTML to books, and you had this ability to jump to random places, kind of a choose your own adventure style situation. And that's what made it a hypermedia rather than just a normal media. And so this hypermedia control, this is sort of the hypermedia control, the first hypermedia control that was out there. The other major, so anchor tags are one type of hypermedia control, the other major one, the only other major one in HTML is the form tag, which came out in HTML2, I think, if I remember correctly. And so these are the only two hypermedia controls available in HTML, but nonetheless, you can build quite a bit of stuff with them. It's pretty interesting how powerful just the idea of hypermedia controls is, given how there's only two of them in HTML. You could still build, all of the original web was built with just these two controls. And so what HTMX is, the thought process to get to HTMX is how can we generalize this idea of hypermedia controls? And to do that, I think what I like to do is look at something like an anchor tag and ask, like, what really is that? What is it telling the browser to do as a hypermedia client? If you, so again, backing up and thinking about it, what it means is, what it tells the browser is, okay, here's some text, show that text to the user. And when a user clicks on it, when a user clicks on that link, I want you to issue an HTTP GET to the specified URL, relative or otherwise. And then what I want you to do, that's going to trigger a request, and then you're going to get back a new HTML document. I want you to replace the current document with that document that was returned. And so if we want to generalize, and HTMX generalizes that idea. So if we want to generalize that concept, then what we need to do is we need to go through this list and just make each of these general, take them a higher level. The first thing that we can generalize is the idea of, like, okay, a link. What's special about links and forms? What about other elements? Like there's nav elements and so forth. There's just all sorts of elements. How come these two are special? One generalization would be make anything, make any potential element on a screen a hypermedia control. Another thing to generalize is that clicks, that idea of clicking. Well, that's just one event of many that triggers in the DOM. So why not make that just general? Any event can trigger these things. 3 is issue an HTTP GET to some URL. And this is, again, something that I call a hypermedia exchange, where there's hypermedia request and response being triggered. And so let's make it possible for any element to trigger those sorts of requests. And then finally, and this is probably the most important one, why should these hypermedia requests be constrained to only replace the whole page? That's the source of a lot of clunkiness in old web applications, because you have this big refresh and you lose your scroll state and all this crazy stuff like that. And so why not make it possible to take that HTML content and put it anywhere in the page? So those are our 4 generalizations that we have available to us, and those are the 4 generalizations that HTMX really focuses on. So in order to do that, we'll really quickly go through the attributes the HTMX provides for each one of those. The first thing to look at is, sorry, there's a button on the screen here that's powered by HTMX. So it has a put, a trigger, and a target. These are HTMX attributes if you've ever seen before. And these put behavior, they give this button hypermedia control-like behavior. So the first thing is to notice is this HX put, and there's a bunch of these. There's HX put, post, get, delete, and so forth. And you can, by putting this attribute on anything in the DOM, suddenly that thing becomes a hypermedia control and can issue that type of HTTP request to that type of endpoint. And so this really, it kind of kills two birds with one stone. First of all, it makes anything potential hypermedia control, and it also makes it possible to issue any type of request. And then the next thing to consider is the event. And so in this case, we want this request, this HTTP put request to be triggered on a click. And so HX trigger lets you specify the event that causes a particular request. So we've generalized that idea. In any event now, a mouse over, for example, if you wanted to, could trigger this request. Now in this case, the HTMX does have decent defaults. So the default for a button is click. So this is technically not necessary in this case, but it's just there to show you what's going on. Whoops. And then finally, HX target, this attribute says, okay, take that response that comes back, whatever HTML it is, and I want you to put it into the inner HTML of the thing with the ID output, which is this little output element down here. This is maybe the most important conceptual element or attribute, I should say, in HTMX, because it really, it takes HTML from this like document-oriented sort of clunky infrastructure to something that includes this concept. It's called transclusion. It's been talked about forever, but this idea of including parts of one document in another document, or including bits of HTML in an existing HTML document. It's an old idea that just wasn't really done, wasn't really explored too much for a while for whatever reason. So the HX target basically lets you say, when this button gets clicked on, something's going to come back, some bit of HTML. It's not going to be a full page probably, but take that HTML and then just jam it inside of this output. So pretty simple at the end of the day. And that's a total of 7 attributes. That's a total of 7 attributes. That, I think, those 7 attributes does a pretty good job of covering the abstraction or the opportunities for generalizing hypermedia controls that we looked at earlier. Now, there are a few more attributes in HTMX that are useful. So like you can specify, HX swap lets you specify how to swap things. Like you want to target the outer HTML and replace the thing rather than put the return content inside of a thing. There's an HX indicator where you can call out an element to be shown during the request. So that gives you the ability to show like a spinner during a request, which is often a good idea from a usability standpoint. Another couple of useful attributes are HX include, which lets you include a form, like all the values in a form or in some element in a request. And then HX select, which lets you pick some part, like if you don't control the server side, or it's difficult to work with the server side, for example, and you want to request a page but only pick out some part of that page, you can use the HX select attribute in order to do that. So it's a practical, so it's not just HTMX isn't just focused on the abstract idea of producing hypermedia controls, or it would have stopped. It tries to give you some useful practical tools that deal with the reality of day-to-day web development as well. All in all, HTMX ends up being about 12 attributes. You can go to HTMX.org reference to look at them. And so that's great. So I hope at least conceptually I've convinced you that HTMX abstracts this notion of hypermedia controls. So what can we do with that? What's possible to do with it? Well, I want to walk you through a couple of quick examples. This is and these are all on htmx.org/examples. So this is a click to edit example, and we start with a div. Let me blow this up so people can see a little better. We start with a div that has it's really poorly formatted, just to make it easy to understand. We start with a div, and that div says, okay, I want the target to be this div, and I want you to swap my outer HTML, so replace the whole thing. And then we have a button that gets the contact one edit UI. It gets back the HTML found at that URL. And what that URL is going to be, or what that HTML is going to be, is a form for updating this thing. And this is all pretty standard web stuff. It's just a form, that you would just like you would use in Web 1.0 in like old school web apps. But it's a little different in that instead of having the normal action attribute on it, it has an HX put. And it says, okay, when someone submits this form effectively, I want you to put the values in this form to this URL, and I want you to target this form and again swap the header HTML. And so what that ends up doing is, this is a little demo of that. What that ends up doing is you've got this admittedly horrible looking UI for displaying a contact, but you can click to edit it, and you can do something like, update the name or whatever, Joey. I guess Joey makes more sense. And you can see what's nice about this. So this is all, and we can come down here and look at the request. So this was the initial state of that div, and then we got the form, so it got replaced with this form. Then we did a put with this bad name, and then we did another get and another put, so forth. But it's all HTML that's flying back and forth. And so what's so great about HTMX? Well, what was great here, and what you might not have noticed, is that we didn't lose our scroll state. Notice our scroll state stayed the same, right? Because we didn't do a full page refresh. That's the big thing. That's what really is good about this, is like you're just updating this little bit, and you don't have this whole big chunk that you get with more traditional web apps. So if this was done with traditional HTML, it would have scrolled up to the top, we would have lost a bunch of context and so on and so forth. And so that's, I think, shows how, just a real basic example of how HTMX can improve things. Another way you can use HTMX effectively is something called lazy loading. So I'm going to hit refresh here, and you can see. So there's this point at which it's loading this graph, and it takes a second. Calculating this graph, it's fake. It's all done with mock stuff. Don't worry about the details of it. But this graph, pretend in your mind that this graph took a while to complete or to compute. And if you just try to include this graph in the page directly as part of the initial render for the page, you would be blocking on the computation that produced that graph. And that can be a bad user experience. And so this uses a pattern in HTMX where you say, okay, I've got a div. I want to issue a get in that div to get a graph, and then put the results into me. By default, it'll put it into this div. And then I want you to trigger on the load event. So when this thing first loads up. So what this ends up doing is it makes this graph URL lazily loaded. And that allows the containing HTML page to render more quickly. And so this can improve user experience for that page. So for example, if you have some page that has an expensive bit to compute, but then has other actions and potential things the user might be interested in, you can use this pattern and make just that little bit of your UI lazily loaded. And then when a user goes to that page, they'll see the page quickly, and then they'll see a little spinner for this thing, but maybe that thing's not important to them. Maybe they can interact with the other things on the page. And so that gives you the ability to have a better user experience while, this is what, 2 attributes, right? So it's not hard to do this. You can very easily introduce lazy loading into your web application. And it works pretty much like every other page in your traditional web application works. And so I like this example because I think it shows how generalizing hypermedia controls has this better than, like, it allows for surprising things. Like if I told you, oh, let's generalize hypermedia controls, the first thing that springs in your mind is probably not going to be like, oh, this would allow me to implement lazy loading and address perceived performance issues with my web page, right? So I think this demonstrates really well that generalized hypermedia controls are pretty cool. They have a lot of power. And then the last one that I always like to do is active search. So this is an example where I'm not going to go into the details of it. I just more want to show you what it does. But you begin, so what I can do here, and you've probably seen this UI before, is I can start typing. And as I type, it filters down this table, right? And this is issuing requests to the server. It's easy, you probably should be using a get, but I've just been lazy and haven't updated it. But it's issuing requests from this element to the server and getting back the results and then jamming them down into this result set down here. And it's doing that as I type, okay? And so that's a really nice user experience compared to like a normal search dialog where you got to type and hit submit and it goes up to the top and then you got to go down and so forth. And so this is what I call active search. Google, I forget what Google does something like this and they call it something different, but that is something that normally people would associate with, really elaborate single page application frameworks. But if I won't go into the details of it, but it ends up being 4 attributes in HTMX, which I think once again shows the power of generalized hypermedia controls. Like you can do a lot with this, a lot more. You know, some people, you'll see people say, oh, HTMX is fine for toy websites, but it can't work for big enterprise style web apps. And I'm like, dude, you know, there's a point at which HTMX doesn't work anymore. I'll admit that, of course. And I've got an essay up about when hypermedia is appropriate on the HTMX website. But you can do a lot more with it than you probably think, especially if you get really nerdy about events and so forth. Okay, so that's 3 examples of HTMX demos. Let's get going here again. Again, it would just by generalizing hypermedia controls, we can do quite a bit. Like in all 3 of those examples, there was no JavaScript written by me as a user of HTMX. So what does that mean for JavaScript? What does that mean for JavaScript? Does that mean that JavaScript is gone? One thing that then kind of what I wanted to address in this talk after this overview of what HTMX was conceptually is HTMX anti-JavaScript? Am I anti-JavaScript? It's true at some level that it is, because you certainly don't need to write nearly as much JavaScript. And there are people who hate JavaScript who really like HTMX because of that. You know, so I think it's fair to say that it's not, you know, anti-JavaScript versus anti-JavaScript maximalist. I don't know. But HTMX definitely makes it possible to use a lot less JavaScript when you're writing your web applications. And in addition to that, HTMX also pushes the focus of your web application onto your backend. And on the back end, what that means is, so one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years is there's been a tremendous amount of pressure to adopt JavaScript or TypeScript on the back end, because people have written these very large JavaScript front-end applications. And why have 2 languages that are complicated? Why not just bring it together and reuse domain logic and all that stuff? And what HTMX does is says, no, you're not going to have a big JavaScript front end. Instead, you're going to have a small front end, and then your back end becomes far more important. And that really hurts JavaScript's. I don't want to say it hurts its usefulness, but it takes away the one big thing that JavaScript has going for it, like the one killer feature of JavaScript, which is that it's there in the browser in a way that no other programming language is. So because HTMX moves the focus back to the back end, all these other languages suddenly can compete with JavaScript as a language for a particular web application. And I think that's a good thing. I like a diversity of programming languages, and you know, so I think that's a good thing. But it definitely, there's no getting around the fact that it makes JavaScript less compelling on the server side, and less compelling overall. So, but I want to say one thing that I do. Well, I think if you look at it the right way, I think HTMX is actually pro JavaScript, and in some ways deeply pro JavaScript, because what HTMX does is it takes the pressure off of JavaScript to be a good general purpose programming language. It's not. It's a bad general purpose programming language. It's messy. It's like C++ in some level. Like, there are good parts of it, and if you use a constrained version of it, it can be okay. But it's, you know, it's just a big, ugly, messy language. But that's okay if you use it as a lightweight scripting language for the web. That's what it was designed for. That's what it was designed for. And hold on one second. I'm sorry, I jumped. Hold on. So in that context of a web scripting language, JavaScript can actually be very good, or at least good enough. You know, I'm a good enough engineer. Like, I think they're saying, like, JavaScript has this killer feature, which it's there in the browser. So, like, take advantage of that fact. So let's look at one more demo, and then reassess where HTMX and JavaScript sort of live with relation. And here, you can see I've actually got some JavaScript that uses the HTMX JavaScript API to, when new content is loaded into a page, it creates it looks up anything with a sortable class on it, and then instantiates a sortable instance on it. And Sortable is a JavaScript library, a library written in JavaScript that enables drag and drop in the browser, and so this is just a bunch of junky JavaScript code to make Sortable work, whatever. But one thing that's cool about this is Sortable emits events. And so we have a form here that is sortable. So the stuff inside of it's going to be sortable. And then it's going to trigger on the end event, which is an event triggered by the Sortable.js library. And it's going to post the items internally to some URL. And so this is basically going to, what's going to happen is when I drag stuff around as enabled by the Sortable.js library, it's going to trigger a save to the server. And so if I come down here, I've got those items and I can drag and drop them. And when I drop them, you can see a post occurs. And so I'm reordering this list and then syncing the order of the list to the server side, sort of at the same time. And so this is an example of us using JavaScript effectively with, Sortable.js is written in JavaScript and HTMX is obviously written in JavaScript. But me as a user of HTMX, I had to write a little bit of JavaScript, but I got some really good bang for my buck from it. I pulled in this Sortable.js library and now I've got this better user experience. It's far better than like even just a vanilla JS implementation just a vanilla HTMX thing with like up and down arrows. That would suck. Like this is really cool. I can put any item wherever I want and I can drag and drop and it just works. And that's it. So very simple HTMX code and pretty simple, JavaScript code, not horrible. Anyways, it's fine. Okay. So this is an example where HTMX works in concert with JavaScript to provide a better user experience. And so I think, again, these two technologies are not oppositional. They're complementary when approached from the right perspective. HTMX couldn't achieve that drag and drop UI without this additional scripting that was made available to us by Sortable.js. And again, we're taking advantage of one of the killer feature of HTMX, which is that it's there in the browser in a way that no other programming language is. And we're using it in the way it's designed for enhancing client-side scripting. Now, I quote Roy Fielding a lot because he wrote a dissertation on the web that gave us a bunch of terms like REST and HADIAS and so forth. He had this to say about scripting. REST allows client functionality to be extended by downloading and executing the code in the form of applets or scripts. This simplifies clients by reducing the number of features required to be pre-implemented. So this is what, in his mind, this is why scripting is allowed or why it's part of the web infrastructure to allow you to implement features that are not part of the core browser behavior, allowing features to be downloaded after deployment, improve system extensibility. And that's what we just saw in that demo. Drag and drop is not part of the web. It's not built in. It's not part, as far as I'm aware anyways, it's not part of HTML5 yet. But nonetheless, we were able to implement it. We were able to provide a better user experience using JavaScript and in concert with HTMX. So I think HTMX is pro JavaScript in that it allows the language to take a deep breath and step back and be what it's actually good at. It's actually good at being a lightweight scripting layer for the web. So let it be that. Don't try and force it to do too much. It's not designed to be, like a great backend language. Maybe TypeScript's pretty good. I don't know. I don't have strong opinions on it. But again, I think that this is an example, like looking at that Sortable example is a really good look at how HTMX is not anti-JavaScript. Instead, it's JavaScript in its right context, enhancing the user experience on the browser, on the client side. And when done in that way, a lot of people who at this point are exhausted with JavaScript might actually have fun. Like I actually find writing small amounts of JavaScript kind of fun because you get it's UI programming, you get the unique stuff with it. So I think that HTMX can, for many people, actually make writing JavaScript fun again. All right, that's my talk. Q&A.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that. Can we get little clappies in the chat? I'm going to turn myself on. I'll make you bigger as well. There we go. Everyone seems to really like it. This was fantastic. I'll also open up YouTube as well and look at YouTube so we have both chats at the same time. We'll be doing Q&As for Carson. Carson, I think one of the first and obvious questions we have to ask is that there was a recent state of JavaScript stuff that's going around right now on the internets, and it looks like HTMX fared pretty well. How you feeling about the rise of HTMX in the last year? I mean, it is a very old library. This is not something new. It's been written about in the 90s, and it's been implemented and being used for the last, 15 years? And so it's not new. How do you feel about the rise, and where do you think it's going?
Everything seems so darn random to me. Like Intercooler JS, which was the predecessor to HTMX, it was released back in 2013. And just I think the tech goes in waves, or there's sort of like back and forth between, particularly when you step back and look at thick client versus thin client. There's sort of been a back and forth in those. The Hypermedia isn't a thin client architecture. Hypermedia clients are very thick, but they're thick in a particular way. And so I can't explain it. I mean, obviously you covered it. Fireship Dev covered it. You can look, like July is when everything blew up, which is when you started covering it and when Fireship mentioned it. So some of it is probably just right place, right time, and the right people got interested in it. I'm very positive in the long run on Hypermedia. HTMX is what it is. It's a tool. It's got problems. Like I wrote it in a pretty idiosyncratic way, and it was IE compatible for a long time. 2.0 won't be. So the implementation, as far as HTMX goes, I think is pretty good. Certainly good enough, and I think will continue to grow. But the ideas of Hypermedia, it's one reason why I try to focus on like the book and the essays. I think the ideas of Hypermedia are more, in the long run, more significant than the particular technology or the particular HTMX.js file, I guess.
So I see this a lot, which is obviously there's been years upon years of many engineers creating React, Solid.js, Angular, Vue, any of the major frameworks. Why should someone try out HTMX when these things have just so much what feels like commercial adoption? And you hear it all the time. I don't see why I would use HTMX when I could just reach for something I already know, or that is industry standard, if you will, quote unquote. Is there some compelling reasons that you think HTMX really wins for, or compelling applications?
Yeah. First of all, I'd say HTMX isn't expensive to look at, right? It's not expensive in the same way to look at like if you're not a React shop and you look at React, like that's a whole massive change. You've got a lot of work ahead of you. Whereas HTMX is pretty lightweight. And if you look at, for example, that lazy loading example, that's two attributes that could potentially on any web application really solve a practical significant problem of like a page loading too slowly. Like write just with two attributes and you're done. And HTMX is 14K, it's got no dependencies, so it's very practical from that standpoint. I think most people who are familiar with the web, if you're not coming in as a complete new web developer, I don't think HTMX takes too long to pick up. At least I don't know, maybe I'm too close to it, but that's my impression. So I think it's low risk, and it's definitely not appropriate for everything. So I wouldn't, I don't think you should use HTMX sort of unthinkingly. There's an essay called "When Should You Use Hypermedia" on the htmx.org/essays webpage, where you can sort of see like these are the things that HTMX is good for. These are the things that it's not. One thing that I would like at some point, I have a lot of fun on Twitter, but I would like to de-escalate the conversation a little bit, because HTMX is just a tool, and like it's good at some stuff and it's not so good at other stuff, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be, it's like it doesn't have to be your identity. It doesn't. You can try it out, and if you like it, cool. And if not, I get it. It's all good. So, it's fun. I find it fun. I think the Hypermedia style of programming is fun. One thing I recommend for some people is like, try it on like an internal tool, maybe like rewriting your entire front end using HTMX is a pretty pretty risky proposition, and you're gonna have to learn a whole bunch and all that stuff. So maybe it doesn't make sense. Depends on the context. But internal tools are often underserved, like they're just kind of afterthoughts. And a little bit of HTMX, like that active search example, for example, could really improve life for employees, for people you work next to and care about and want to make their lives better. So just like, a few attributes, and suddenly they've got a much better user experience. They're happy, you're happy, and you didn't risk the whole company on an HTMX conversion. So I don't know. That's kind of my thoughts around that.
I do love that idea of internal tool approach, because right now where I work, we have a lot of stuff pre-set up with like React. It's like it's actually really difficult not to write an internal tool that's not in React, but due to how there's a bit of server-side rendering, it's really simple actually just to convert it straight into an HTMX tool, and I can move really, really fast now by simply just avoiding that whole thing. Because one of the biggest like barriers to entry for good tools is that when I started doing it, everything had to be React, and like it just took me a long time to build something simple, right? There's a lot of code you have to end up producing. A lot of build time, a lot of waiting, all the things that kind of go in between it all. And so just having something I can quickly explore really just fast. I don't need I don't need much for libraries or anything. I can just kind of 0 to 60 really quick. It's been very refreshing, and I don't feel nearly as like, oh gosh, I have an internal tool. Like, do I want to even support this? Do I even want to go down this route of creating it? Because once I know I create it, I'm also supporting it. And that's like a lot of effort. So I do want to ask you to follow up one more question about this kind of whole direction, because you said 14K. I'm very excited about HTMX2 because I'd love to see that you're dropping a huge amount of support. You're thinning up stuff. How much smaller is this going to make it? Are we going to see HTMX2 being like below 10K across the wire?
I wish, man. It's just I got all excited. We dropped. The problem is the compression algorithms are pretty darn good. So, I think right now it's at 13K in the 2.0 branch. So and it would be really hard. There are a few, since we're dropping IE support, there are some areas we can remove code, but my suspicion is that getting below 10K, which initially my goal is to keep the thing below 10K. I think it's going to be really hard to do. And that sucks. There's some clean room implementations of HTMX or HTMX ideas. There's a guy working on something called Datastar. And his is done in I think it's done in TypeScript and transpiled, and very heavily optimized. And I think he has it in like the 6 to 8K range. But just even the history support is it's just so much, and then gathering inputs and like getting all the little things right. Like if someone has a what is it, form ref in another spot, and you got to go out and get that stuff too. There's just a lot of little junk that has to get done. And whenever I'm feeling bad about it, I go look at bundle phobia, and it's like, I think 14K is like 16 milliseconds over like old 4G. And I'm like, all right, Carson, chill out. Like it's going to be, that's the first request, and then it's cached forever. And like, it's all right. It'll be okay. But I do wish, that part of me there's something about that 10K. Like if I could have kept it under 10K, that would have been great. But
do you think you'd ever reduce some of the hyperscript support to get something below 10K? Like, because I know that you get a lot of power with HTMX as a library, and I don't know how much people are actually taking advantage of all the features. Is there going to be a light version or something to kind of strip it all the way down to that quote unquote ideal under 10?
Yeah, you could. I'd have to look at it. It's the other thing that's tough about it. The good and the bad thing about HTMX is it's written in one file, and so you can't pick and choose what features you want from it. It's kind of just like, boom, here's a thing. But it would be hard given the current setup and my current mindset to do that. But I think, again, there's one reason why I say the ideas of HTMX are probably more important than HTMX itself. I think other people are going to start offering libraries like that. Like, hey, here's just like a really like you could do probably an 80-20 of HTMX, especially if you dropped history support in like, 4K or even less. I mean, people are doing reactive things in like less than a K. So I got to think that like someone who's really clever and just takes advantage only of like modern APIs, doesn't worry at all about like anything. You could do something pretty tight and small. But on the other hand, then as soon as you run into like, oh, I need history support, well, okay, So that's kind of, HTMX does have a little bit of a kitchen sink mindset in that the kitchen sink is completing HTML. Like any feature that
Yeah.
HTML is missing, we want to provide that as a hypermedia. And so, it's a design choice. I wish I could have kept it under 10K, but I couldn't figure out how to do it.
For those that I see a bunch of questions being like, but why 10K? 14K is already small enough. Something about 4-figure JavaScript just seems so dang appealing comparatively to 5-figure.
Yeah.
And so I don't know.
Yep.
I think I didn't even have to ask you. We just both immediately knew 4-figure just feels way cooler.
Yeah, you get 10 fingers, right? It's like, if you can go under that, that's cool.
It is. All right. Let's see. I'm going to just scour some things and see if we have any good questions in here. You got to be careful about chat. They ask mediocre questions sometimes.
Oh, that's all good.
All right. Let's see. How does it feel to have made such a huge impact on the web with such a small library and such a simple concept?
Boy, it's a little surreal. It feels like it might be a Truman Show situation, like maybe you're in on this whole thing.
We're going to pull the rug on you here very soon. Don't worry.
It's just, exactly. Like, you're like, psych, you're an idiot. I don't know. It's crazy. It shows that, you never know what's going to happen. Cause like, again, with Intercooler, I'd given up on making a dent beyond, the few people that liked it. And then COVID happened and I rewrote Intercooler's HTMX, and right place, right time, and just hanging around. So it's pretty cool. I'm not going to lie. I'm very surprised. I'm as surprised as any of you that this happened.
Let's see. Hold on. So here's kind of an interesting one. If your backend server is now responsible for your API and rendering, similar to something like Next, if that is down/slow, has a bug, a client can no longer run anything compared to a SPA, which can show a spinner, retries, etc. How do you get around this?
You can do scripting in HTMX apps to do the same thing. HTMX doesn't do it out of the box. And obviously, in a hypermedia driven application, which is what I would call an application written mainly in HTMX, if the server is down, you're in a worse spot than you are if you have an SPA that's doing like, optimistic saving and all that stuff, right? Like, so there's no doubt that you are more reliant on the server if you're using a hypermedia approach. However, anything you can do, the HTMX fires a tremendous number of events, and if you're a good JavaScript programmer, then you can use those events in order to provide a UI when connectivity is down, to show a div or whatever it is, to say, hey, things aren't working right now. So it's doable, but it's work, and it's scripting work. That's something that just has to be done on the client side. And so I'm part of the point of this talk is, and this is one thing I say, people say, oh, HTMX, anti-JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you know what? In 5 years, some of the best HTMX developers are going to be front-end people who know JavaScript, CSS, HTML inside out, and then have figured out how to use SQL effectively on the server. Like, those people are in a position to produce great HTMX applications because they understand HTML. They can use scripting effectively where it's useful. We get the 80-20, like, handle the offline situation or whatever it is. But then they're also going to be effective using the most expressive and powerful stuff available on the server side, stuff like SQL, which is powerful in a way that things like GraphQL just can never be, mainly due to security reasons. So getting back to the question, it's doable. It's work. It's just work you have to do in JavaScript.
I also kind of want to double click on something. If your API is down/slow, most websites I use don't have a great experience. Like, very, very little actually have like a really solid, hey, we're down right now, we're not really sure what's happening. You only see that in like the top, like, very few websites. So, I mean, in my head, I normally don't try to cover the 0.01% of the cases that I really want to cover. I really just want to try to make sure the thing works first, the happy case, and then slowly go from there. So
Yeah.
it's, covering the case in which one of your APIs are down. There's just so many hypothetically bad situations, as TJ is saying. For HTMX are just bad situations for all websites. Yeah, I like what TJ says. Many hypothetically bad situations for HTMX are just bad situations for all websites. You already have the skill issues for
Yeah.
React Andes anyways, right? It no matter what, you made a website with React, that's a spa. It still doesn't work if you try to go there and the website's down. Like nothing, it doesn't
Yeah.
change the calculus fundamentally.
Yeah, well, and like people say, oh, you could, for example, like the subway problem. You go into a subway and you're trying to book a ticket, and suddenly you lose connectivity, and like you wanted to book that ticket. Well, okay, you were trying to book a ticket. Maybe the SPA version or whatever you're using says, yeah, you booked the ticket, but then you come out of the tunnel and now the ticket is already taken or is not available, or the seat or whatever is not available. Like, how do you resolve that situation? Do you notify the user app? Like, it becomes very complicated. This is one of the great simplifying aspects of hypermedia driven applications and just thin style. It's a long conversation, but is that you're using the server as a source of truth. And so you're able to synchronize, if you have multiple people competing for resources, you're able to synchronize that and have one source of truth for all that stuff. So even some of the examples that people will throw out like on Twitter or Reddit or whatever, where they're like, well, how would HTMX handle this? I'm like, like, there's just no good way to handle it. Like, what are you going to use? Like, what are those CDRTs to like figure out your ticket? Like, come on, guys, just put in a database. And
Yeah.
Mobile's pretty good these days.
There's actually something greatly simpler about HTMX, specifically in those situations, which is it must rely on the server. And so by not having some sort of cached smart state, you have literally no logic or very thin amounts of logic to say, like, hey, sorry, it's like refresh to get the new state of the world versus like, I'm going to try to reconcile what has happened in some unknown set of changes between when you started to like that's most the work and most the bugs on websites that I come across is always a reconciliation between what the server has to say and what the client thinks it should be saying. And that's just like, it's a super hard problem. I mean, remember, I wrote FileCore. I spent years writing that darn thing. And that thing is literally the attempt to try to rationalize the client state to the server side state and trying to effectively cache data from the server. It's I quit Netflix over it. Okay, it's a really hard. It's like an impossible problem. Like it is not easy. All right, so someone says, can you please explain LOB versus SOC advantages? I'll let you define those terms and do that.
LOB is locality of behavior, and SOC is separation of concerns. Separation of concerns is a much older concept, and it's the idea that you should separate your concerns into different, typically files, but modules, however you want to think about it. But the canonical example in web development is that you should separate your scripting and your markup and your styling into three different types of files. So your HTML files, your JavaScript files, and your CSS files. So that was a big idea early on in web development. It's still, a lot of people still like that idea a whole bunch. Locality of behavior is a thing that I came up with as sort of a response to separation of concerns, where what locality of behavior says is that you should put code that does something with a thing as close to the thing as possible. And so an example of separation of concerns is to have an HTML file with a button in it, and then a JavaScript file that uses a CSS selector to look up that button and hook in some logic to the on-click event. That's an example of separation of concerns. You have the logic in one file and the markup in another file. Whereas the locality of behavior version of that same button would be the button with an on-click attribute on it, and then the code written right there in the button. And the argument for separation of concerns is that by separating your concerns, you make things less brittle because you don't intersperse two different pieces of logic with one another. The argument for locality of behavior is that when I go and look at the button, I can see what the button does right there. And so I argue in favor of locality of behavior and to an extent against separation of concerns, because my experience with separating concerns has not been great. You're looking at a button, wondering what it does. How do you figure out what it does? Whereas you just put the code on the button, then you can see what it does. And that mixes two concerns, so logic and markup. But to me, that's not as big a deal as being able to understand a button just by looking at it, not having to move around in a bunch of different files. So that's those are the two ideas. Locality of behavior is sort of it's a thing again that I came up with as a way to, when people come in hot about separation of concerns, say, yeah, separations of concerns is a thing. On the other hand, there's also locality of behavior, and really smart people have suggested, Richard Gabriel is the guy who I kind of riff on for the essay. There's an essay on htmx.org about it. And he talks about how grouping code grouping stuff that's related together, even if the quote unquote concerns aren't necessarily the same, is very good for the maintainability of software. And I agree with that.
So I have kind of, there's two good questions here. And so I don't know which one to ask first. So we're just going to we're going to go for it. Let's see. If you have multiple different types of clients, web browsers, mobiles, and other service/applications, each with different requirements or different data representation needs, it seems like you need to have a mix of API server, HTMX server for mobile, one for web. And let's see, or do you fork your logic based on a per client? Like, how do you handle a bunch of different clients? And let's also throw in there, like, you have like a native app that requires JSON. How do you do all of those things?
Yeah. I suggest splitting those two things up, not just So I think it's correct to say that if you adopt a hypermedia architecture for your web application, and you have other clients, you're going to need to have two things. You're going to need to have your hypermedia API and then your JSON API. And the question becomes, should you use the accept header? If you've ever, the accept header in HTTP allows you to make a request to a URL and then specify, I want JSON or I want HTML. My contention is that you should split those two things into completely separate, maybe even separate projects from one another, and they should reuse the same domain objects. So all your business logic, all your stuff that doesn't involve taking web requests and turning them into actions and then rendering a response, all that stuff should be encapsulated in a layer that's below or away from, like, something different than your web layer. And so you should have a controller. You should have controllers for your JSON API and controllers for your web application, and those should be separate from one another. I don't think you should use the accept header and have everything going through the same URLs. I think you should have an explicit separate set of URLs for your JSON API. And the reason that I think that is because if you work with HTMX for any amount of time, what you're going to notice is that your URLs, first of all, they tend to change around really dramatically, because as your UI needs change, and this is the great thing about hypermedia, is that it's really good at not needing a stable API, because you get new hypermedia content, has new URLs in it, and it just works. Whereas JSON-based APIs, those are fixed data APIs. They have to be much more stable. And so if you actually if you separate those two, this is an area where I think there is a legitimate argument for separation of concerns. If you separate those things, then your JSON API can be very stable. It can do things like rate limiting, like all these things that you care about when you're interacting with third parties or whatever. Maybe you use a completely different format than JSON to talk to your native API, right? Maybe use protocol buffers or whatever. But if you separate those two things out, then your web app can change really dramatically. So if you need to introduce lazy loading for a UI, you introduce a URL for it, you make lazy loading, you work with two attributes, and it's great. And it's not going to bother your JSON API at all that you've got this new specialized endpoint for your UI needs. Whereas your JSON API can be nice and stable. To be honest, like, once you get it right, it's probably not going to change that much, because it's a data API. Hopefully it's pretty stable. So if you separate those two things, it's a relief for your JSON API, because your JSON API is not being dragged around by the needs of your web application. And your web application is able to take advantage of the flexibility and the chaos that hypermedia can absorb in a way that JSON-based architecture just can't.
Is there any concern over the chatty nature of HTMX? I wonder how bad it gets with a large number of users, where you need to have a call for every interaction, compared to a traditional SPA with a couple calls on load to populate data. By the way, before you jump into that, I think that is a slight mischaracterization of SPAs in general, in the sense that if you use any SPA, like if you go to Twitter, if you go to Netflix, if you go to Facebook, if you go anywhere, the moment you start moving anything, you'll notice that you will get like tens of calls every time you barely scroll your wheel. So I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but give it that you can say that SPAs have the ability to cache results better than HTMX does.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree with you. My experience with single page applications has not been as like amazing as many of the advocates for single page applications seem to suggest. I think one of the things that HTMX does is, since it collapses all the complexity between a user action and a request, is it makes it much more obvious what's going to cause a request. And so you can actually have a better idea, and you can engineer for interaction speed based on that. Whereas like if you're using a really complicated reactive system, like who knows what's going to cause a request, right? There's so many layers between a user moving a mouse and the actual backend synchronizing, like who knows? So I think that it helps in that sense. There's also a lot of features of HTML that are available. For example, the detail, I forget what it's called. I think it's the detail element. Like you can stream down a bunch of stuff in HTML, and using CSS or just standard HTML elements have things like expand, collapse, and all that sort of stuff. So you can return a lot of data. And in fact, returning a lot of HTML data is going to be more efficient in some ways than returning a lot of JSON data. You know, like if you have a table, for example, returning a table of HTML is often smaller than the equivalent JSON representation, because equivalent JSON representation repeats the field names over and over again. That stuff, it tends to be round off errors. So, you know, yeah, it's possible to make a really chatty, like if you try and like issue a request on every mouse move and you don't debounce that, which is a feature HTMX has, yeah, it's going to be pretty chatty. But you can, you know, design around that. And then finally, the last thing I'd say is like scripting is allowed. I'm not saying you can't script in HTML. You know, I just think when you're synchronizing state for the server, that should probably be done with Hypermedia instead. So, you know, it's all doable. My experience with HTMX apps is that they're pretty fast. There's that port that guy did of an application from React to HTMX. It's available on the HTMX org essays page, and their time to load for the first page went down like by 50 to 60%, and they were able to handle much larger data sets than they were in React, because it's just a much lighter weight approach. Sort of goes with the grain of the browser rather than trying to do all this other stuff. So my experience is that performance can be very good, but it's just, you know, again, it's just a tool, and you can write a bad HTMX app just like you can write a bad React app. I think it might be a little bit easier to write a good HTMX app than a good React app.
Yeah, the pit of success is likely easier to fall into with HTMX, just because, like you said, the change points are very well understood and very well defined. It's very hard not to know where your application actually changes. It's very easy to know when you're kind of like, oh, this just doesn't make any sense. I'm using something wrong here. And lastly, you have a server that goes, okay, is this person logged in? Oh, this person is logged in. I need to send down some extra data in the JSON request. You have a client that goes, hey, is there the extra data in the JSON request? Okay, let's take that extra data and let's process and grab some things out of it. And so you end up with this duplicity of logic that can be kind of complicated and cumbersome to work with, that I think a lot of people don't really talk about, which is you already go on the server and go, okay, you're logged in. Do you have permissions to view this button? Oh, you do have permissions to view this button. I'm going to now create some sort of data field to say you may now look at this button. It won't be a button, but you can look at the button. Next one, do you have permissions for this thing? Oh, you do. You are an editor. I'm going to give you also the delete button, right? Like you give all these things that you send down, and then the client has to effectively take a second data set with a different structure and walk across that to produce the HTML. So you really get this like dual translation. You get a double translation as a single translation. For me, that's like the easiest way I think about it for why HTMX makes it simpler, is that you don't translate twice. You translate once, which typically means I have less chance for just putting in a bug, less time spent coding, less time thinking about two separate data models. Instead, I just have one. And though TypeScript is really good, JSDoc is really good at kind of alleviating the pain of thinking of two different models, it still is two different models you're working with. It still is harder, no matter what, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Removing layers at the end of the day is usually good for performance.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, let's see.
You know?
By the way, do you have any well-known applications or any applications you'd like to shout out that use HTMX besides for that sweet job interview app that you just saw recently saying HTMX required?
Yeah. You can go to htmx.org/webring, and there's some apps there. ComSpace I actually consult with a company called ComSpace. They're a awesome South African company, and Johan, the guy who runs it, is awesome. And he kind of went all in on HTMX. He had used Intercooler, and then he kind of early on in HTMX was like, okay, is this really a thing? Like, are we going to do this? And I said yes, and he said, okay, cool, come and help us do it right. And so that's a great app. It's very focused on South Africa. So. But there's a couple other apps that are big. The OCaml website uses HTMX. I think it's a pretty simple way that it uses it, but that's kind of cool. Berkeley, I went to Berkeley for undergrad, so the Berkeley Nobel Prize website uses it. There's a couple other in there. There's what's that one? I always forget the name. Hold on. HTMX.org WebRing.
There's the French company that does the whole PDF reader one.
Yes. Yeah, there were some AI people. Nike Vision uses it. Zorro Management's the one that's probably the most elaborate, which is sort of a project management system. It was written, my understanding is it was written by a guy who's a game developer, and he's like, I don't like any of these project management systems. So he just built his own, which is way better.
Sounds very game
developer-y.
So it's like, what do you do? I program for 72 hours straight.
Yeah, pretty much. But he uses a lot of, that's a good example where he's using a boatload of JavaScript as well alongside HTMX, and the two, play really well together. So again, I think that's evidence that HTMX is not necessarily anti-JavaScript.
Nice. Well, thank you, Carson, for being on here. I don't want to take up any more of your time. This was absolutely fantastic. I am very excited to see 2024. Where does HTMX go? Does it keep the limelight? Do we start seeing a lot more force out there, or was this just a 2023 unique special?
No one's going to be able to take the second half of 2023 away from me. So yeah, it's all good. That was pretty cool. And again, I appreciate you taking a chance on HTMX. It's definitely a different way of doing things, but hopefully people find it useful.
Yeah. Well, you got me right away. Technically, TJ was the one that told me to go check it out. And I mean, the reality is that I've been hating client-side state, and I just didn't have a good way to formulate why I hated it. I just knew that I just hate this translations and all this. And I just was like, I don't know what I want. I just know I don't want this. And I don't know how do I say the thing I don't want? And so if I wouldn't have done HTMX, I probably would have liked React Server Components as the alternative, because at least I'm programming on the server and just trying to keep everything I can to the server. Like I don't mind that perspective. It's just that it's still not exactly what I want. This is what I want. So hopefully 2024 is even better.
Cool. Yeah, man.
All right.
Hey, Big Sky DevCon. It's coming at some point.
Yeah. Tell me the details. Let's make this work. Just don't make it during PHP USA, because I'm going to the PHP Laravel conference. Okay.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. The details aren't finalized yet. But I'll let you know.
All right. Deal. Take care.
Cool, man. Cheers.